So, people, good evening. We'll start now. Um, Thank you, Abhishek, for taking the time to join this group and address the group. So, I know very little about you, but what I know is that you are an alum of IIT Delhi, and you are doing some amazing work in social sector. So I'll quickly hand it over to you with this very brief introduction, and you can add to that introduction, and you can start your talk. Over to you, Abhishek.
Uh, Good. And how many, for how many minutes should I sort of speak right now?
So total is about 60. You can
Sure.
talk for about 40 minutes if you want,
Sure.
and then we can leave some time for interaction. But it's up to you how you want to pace it.
Perfect. So, hello everyone, and this is Abhishek. I'll briefly introduce myself, but before that, I just wanted to sort of put it out there in case anyone want to ask questions in between. That's also okay. 40 minutes would be a long time for me to just speak
Yeah,
continuously.
sure.
Right. So if anyone feel free to just shoot anything in between as well. So to briefly introduce myself, as Nimish mentioned, I finished my engineering from IIT Delhi as a software programmer in 2013. I had two startups, one of which I started while I was in third year of my college. It fortunately got acquired just after my college time. And that was the time, I was really obviously very young. I was barely 21. And I was just thinking like what to do with whatever little money I got out of that. So I started asking my peers, my seniors, and people around me, like, what would they do if they had lots of money and so on, etc., etc. And somehow most of the answers that people gave to me, I mean, they didn't interest me, to be honest. Like I didn't, I had a very minimalistic and a very basic lifestyle. So that was a very important time for me to sort of question my own relationship with money. But by that time, because we were acquired, I joined as a startup as a C2 and the co-founder. We raised about 18 crores. We were doing well. But during this time, I sort of realized that my interest does not lie in for-profit sector, and I want to go back to. I mean, I want to actually start focusing on social impact, and that is when how I joined Delhi government somewhere around 2016. I roughly worked there for almost 8 to 9 months, and over there, I met a lot of students who were doing well in schools, but somehow I realized that they had very limited options to pursue after school, and that's where NavGurukul as an idea sort of came about. I'll just very briefly discuss what NavGurukul is, and then probably yeah.
Yes, yeah, go on.
Yeah, so I'll just briefly discuss what NavGurukul is, and then probably I'll focus on the main pillars of what defines us. So at NavGurukul, we run 1 year residential courses for students from marginalized communities to come and learn software programming and get guaranteed jobs. The reason why we started software programming was largely because we knew software really well, so we knew we could teach it. But the major inspiration was very simple that if you look at jobs today, on one side there are employers who say we don't have quality talent, and on the other side, in a country like India, we have a huge volume of people who are looking forward to meaningful and aspirational jobs. And this divide is even clearer if you go into, let's say, a government school where most of the students do not end up having good careers after the school, right? So we wanted to solve that problem of higher education, and that's how Navgurukul sort of came about. So in sort of one very simple brief line, we want to focus on higher education for one and all. And obviously question was like, how do we start or where do we start? So we wanted to start with the most marginalized people, largely because the number of options at that level are even further limited than, let's say, if you are from middle class. So the problem is true even for middle class, right? I mean, it's not just limited to people who do not have money to sort of do the education. But at the same time, if you do not have money, it's far more worse. And that's where we decided we are going to focus, even though our mission or our vision is to sort of do it for everyone, but our immediate goal would be to work with the most marginalized people. So we decided four major sort of pillars for the work that we're going to do. One, it has to be really, really inclusive. So as I mentioned, our work was supposed to focus as much as possible on the people who are most vulnerable in a sense. And the second part of it was to do it in a very affordable manner. We just feel that if the education is too expensive, even if the students are not paying, even if they are raising funds for it externally, it becomes very hard to make it work at larger numbers, and hence it has to be affordable. It has to work at reasonable prices, and that links us to the third point, where it has to be scalable, right? I mean, if you're building something and we build it for 10 people or 100 people, it doesn't really matter, especially in a country like India. The solutions need to be scalable from day one. And the fourth and very important point for us was that it has to be holistic in nature. We didn't want to sort of just teach people for the sake of teaching or just getting them jobs. The education itself has to cover different aspects of learning, including employability being the major one, but there have to be a focus on the all-round development of the students. So that's how, I mean, those are some of the pillars that we sort of focused on. So if I just sort of talk a little bit about how we realized them. So one of the very important ways we sort of achieved these goals was through self-governance. So idea was very simple, that we run residential campuses. So as I mentioned, we run residential courses for students. So we have 5 campuses right now in Dharamshala, Bangalore, Pune, Sarjapur, and Tripura, and we are setting up new campuses very actively. And all of these are residential campuses. And if you're running a residential campus, the cost can be really high, right? I mean, you have to take care of their food, accommodation, laptop, internet, staff costs, etc. So if you want to keep it affordable, self-governance really, really helps, because we could essentially work on a very low staff model, essentially. There are no cooks in our system, no cleaners, etc., etc. There's a student council and a constitution which governs the council and the student teams. And the students are basically divided into different tribes, which are very much like your houses or anything in schools or colleges that we see, to create smaller groups where the bonding is stronger. But between these 3 entities, which is council, constitution, tribes, most of the major functioning of especially the operational part of the campus, is handled directly by the students. And that also end up being a very important source for them to learn as leaders, right? I mean, it's not just them learning something in theory, but actually practically working to figure things out. So that's one part of it. But the other very important part of it, which I believe very strongly on, is how do we trust people? So there's this very interesting quote by Charlie Munger that I really love, where he talks about how what may be seen as trust for an organization might be perceived as over trust by other people, but if it works, right? I mean, so at NavGurukul, one of the very core ideas that if we are going to work with the students, with them at the center, so we have to trust with the fact that they are here to learn. So I believe that unfortunately a lot of our education system and practices are actually developed with a very strong distrust in the student. We basically design a lot of interventions where it is assumed that the student is not interested in learning, or they're not serious about their future, and hence we have to make sure that they're learning, and the system becomes aggressive rather than the student demanding it. And that is where we wanted to design a system where we can essentially trust the students with their learning. We can trust the fact that they are coming from faraway parts of the country to our residential centers, and they're coming there to learn. And if that is not happening, then maybe something is wrong, rather than just entirely putting the blame on the intentions of the student. So trust is essentially a very important part of how any of the student-centric model is going to function, right? If you want a student council to effectively function, you would need to give them powers, and that cannot happen unless you start trusting them. So this is an image I really like. So there was this time in our campus when, so we have this practice called OIL, which is a short form for Opportunity to Improve and Learn. So there's a student council, it has Disco, disciplinary coordinator, and so on, and many other. So one time, Disco observed something with the girls, and the Disco, who was one of the students, she asked them to basically go and clean the ground nearby. And these girls, they had, I think, roughly a few hours to go and clean. And when they went to clean, someone just told them, "Why are you cleaning? Just burn everything, and everything will basically, be okay." And I was just looking, and just from the roof, I was just looking at how things are going on, and then I saw that they actually burned in the ground and using the time to play with themselves. And that was the time it reminded me, while I was burning from inside also, what they're doing with the ground. But sometimes you have to let things burn, right? I mean, sometimes things will go waste. Sometimes things will go completely according to, completely against or antithesis to what you have planned. But it's okay to let things go in a way where you don't want them to, and let them take their own shape. And that I feel has been one of the very important learnings, and something which follows when you talk about trust, right? I mean, if you talk about trust and you're not okay things taking their own time and shape, it is going to be extremely hard. And similarly, one of the things that I realized during my time at NavGurukul is how essentially in an environment where the students are leading, where the leadership in itself is a lot more decentralized, right? I mean, when a problem is going to come, the problem will not belong to one person, but rather a larger group of people. And in such environments, problem essentially end up being blessings in disguise. So this is a picture which reminds me of a very hard time at NavGurukul when we started our Bangalore campus and we were facing a lot of discrimination. The girls were routinely facing harassment from the community over there. A lot of issues around being outsider, inside over there, like we are from north, etc. Why are you coming here? Because we were in a little bit rural parts of the Bangalore, and essentially, even with all those things, and we did many things to sort of work on that. But the most beautiful thing that happened was that the campus was really close to each other. I think in the history of NavGurukul since last 4 to 5 years, that was a time when the entire campus was so close to each other. They were so connected. Everyone was so connected to each other that ultimately all those problems that came and the way we worked on them, it ended up being a blessing. The campus became stronger. And we did many things. We did Nukkad Nataks. Not we. I mean, most of these things were basically done by the students. So they did Nukkad Nataks. They were basically doing something called fearless walks. They were doing flash mobs in the community. So they were doing a lot of community awareness while they were pursuing this course. But it really helped them grow in many different ways. And a lesson I just learned around very similar time, which still stays with me, is in such an environment when a rung of leadership leave, or some people leave who you might see as leaders today, it creates vacuum for new leadership to emerge. And again, this happens a lot, especially if your system is not dependent on 1 or 2 or 3 people. The system essentially is relying on multiple layers of leadership, and every layer is strong enough. The moment you remove one layer, the other layer will come up. And this was a picture when many of our girls basically, who were basically almost acquiring all the leadership positions in the council, and one of them basically Anu was essentially also part of our team. They all got directly a job at Mindtree, and they had to leave with a 1 day or 2 day notice, if I remember correctly, but not more than 2 days for sure. So initially it seemed extremely hard and impossible that all the leadership that we have been grooming for probably at least 6 to 8 months, suddenly all of that layer is going to evaporate in 1 single day or 2 single day. I mean, 2 days basically. But what we realized immediately was that within 15 days or 20 days, new people took over and they could do it as well as the previous leadership. And that for me was a very transformational time because it really reinforced my own belief in how leadership work, and essentially how in a decentralized setup it can create wonders. So those are basically very loosely about how do we work on self-governance in the campus. And the reason why I'm talking about self-governance here is largely because these ideas are not limited to NavGurukul or our campuses in general, but these are ideas that can be used in any existing setup to create a culture of ownership, to create a culture where leadership is not centric to 1 or 2 people, but rather is more of a reflection on of everyone who's involved in the system. I'll just briefly pause here. If anyone wants to add anything, ask anything here, and then I'll move to the next part. There's nothing else.
So Abhishek, I think we'll have tons of questions, but I think maybe if you just run through it, we'll know what you're going to cover and what you haven't covered. So
sure. Okay. Okay. Since I'm not able to see people, it's just hard to know if they're following. But yeah, I'll take over on that. So essentially, the second part of the system that we believe very strongly is self-direction. So when essentially focusing on students running the campus, a very important part of their learning is how do they direct their learning. And a big part of this learning, we believe, at least in our campuses, we work through self-direction. So in our campuses, unlike the traditional model of education, we do not have exams, we do not have teachers. It's a system which works with the students for them to chart out their own journeys. Obviously, there are certain processes that help us in that, and I'm just going to sort of take out 5 minutes to talk about them. But largely, the system is centered around three very important parts. One is effective mentorship. Since there are no teachers per se, uh, we basically make sure that each and every student has access to one-on-one mentor who happens to be a senior student. So let's say if I join campus today, and let's say Nimesh is 3 months senior to me or 4 months senior to me in the course, which is pretty much like 1 year senior person in your college. The person is tasked to take care of my mentorship needs, and that is a part of my day-to-day functioning. So it is very well assumed and part of the culture where people have to sort of work with other students as they grow or mature in their own journeys. And the second part of this is inclusivity, and it goes back to the one of the very core values that I mentioned is where we want to make sure that each and every student is getting a job. It's a very interesting course, right? I mean, we do a one year, roughly 1 year or 15 months course, where the students are coming from all over the country. We have students coming from Kashmir, Mizoram, Manipur. Assam, Gujarat, Rajasthan, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, almost all parts of the country, we have students coming in at our residential centers. And for these students, it's a very, it's a lot of distance to travel sometimes, right? I mean, if, let's say someone is coming from Bihar to Bangalore, it might be a 3-day train journey, especially because they're not necessarily coming from Patna, they may be coming from a village. So in such a case, each and every minute of the person who is coming is essentially really, really precious. And what makes it even more important is the fact that if these girls are not going to get a job out from this course, there's a possibility and a very strong one that they will be married immediately, limiting a significant number of options that they would otherwise have access to. So for us, inclusivity is at the core. How do we ensure that each and every student who comes and join us get a job, which we actually guarantee when they do? And to make it happen, we basically, and the one-on-one mentorship is really important. And the third part here, which is relationships, is very, very critical. So what we sort of focus on in the campus is how do we nurture relationships among the students such that they support each other, not just because we are telling them to, but they actually feel the need for it, right? I mean, it's just something as simple as helping your friends out. So a lot of our work, even though we don't have teachers, we have community managers in our campuses who work extensively on building relationships, who works extensively on conflict resolution to ensure that the campus has a very favorable environment for people to learn and support each other. And since now there's no 1 to 30 or 1 to 50 model or 1 to 20 model where someone is teaching 20 people, inclusivity is easier because each and every child is being given mentorship from a specific individual who would design that mentorship for that specific person. So let's say if Nimesh is guiding me, he will guide me at my pace, not necessarily at a pace which someone else is comfortable with. Right. So yeah, I mean, so fortunately, so as Anuradha mentioned, yes, I mean, fortunately, a lot of these ideas that I'm talking about in this conversation are not our ideas at all. I mean, these are ideas which many organizations have been trying to do in India and have been doing for a long time. And you will find many implementations. For example, Sikh Mall by Sonam Wangchuk in Ladakh is a place where we got a lot of inspiration for, especially for establishing a student council, right? I mean, so a lot of these ideas are essentially borrowed from existing organizations, and in fact, to an extent, they are actually quite common in some of the alternative education styles. That it's very even hard to quote that we actually got it from somewhere. For example, relationship building in education is not a new idea. In fact, that's something which almost every education paper would talk about. But there's something that we have been focusing a lot when we talk about our own campus culture and academics. The other part of our learning in the campus is essentially to teach, right? I mean, so as I mentioned, people are continuously mentoring people. So a very important part is to sort of support and encourage them to take time to learn to teach. And the idea is again very simple, something which is very heavily talked about in education. If you have to teach a concept, you have to know it so much better than what you would otherwise, right? I mean, if I just know, let's say, how a certain concept work, it is actually much easier than actually being able to explain it to someone, right? So we essentially actively promote teaching and ensure that the students understand that by teaching they also learn themselves a lot and also improve their own articulation and comprehension skills. This is a third and a very important part of how we basically work on academics. It's just a graphic that I really love. It's basically about an examiner asking different animals to climb the tree, and accordingly they're going to sort of judge who is the best amongst them to who is probably the best among them to climb the tree. At the same time, probably the answer in terms of who is best to climb the tree may come. But what would definitely not come is who is more suited to do what, or who actually put in more effort to sort of actually climb the tree, right? That's why our rewards or our work at campus is strictly focusing on inputs-based gamification rather than output-based rewarding. So I'll give you a very simple example for this. So let's say if we are doing a hackathon, which most of the colleges and institutions will do. So in a hackathon like this, typically the awards will be for the most, let's say, there's just some noise here. Yeah. So let's say there are certain, let's say, prizes. The prizes might be the best application award or whatever. But these are all outcome-based awards, right? The award is basically tied to the outcome that is achieved. In our system, we focus a lot on input-based rewarding or tracking or gamification. So, for instance, in a hackathon, the kind of awards that we'll work on might be like the team which helped the other teams the most. So that way, in hackathons, instead of cultivating individuality, we are cultivating helping each other out, right? Similarly, so that rewards the value of helping each other out. Or an award can be the team which worked hardest during the hackathon, despite independent of their outcome, or the team which basically tried to take the maximum leap in terms of what they knew and what they tried to implement. Again, an input, right? Maybe I tried to take the maximum leap and I failed, and it's okay because we're not rewarding the outcome here as much as we are rewarding the fact that you made that attempt. So consciously we make sure that all of the conversations that that are happening in the campuses, all of the awards that are going on, all of the gamification or tracking that is going on is heavily centered on the inputs. And inputs can be of multiple types. One of the inputs is putting in effort. Another part of the input can be values that someone bring onto the table. So as I mentioned, one of the awards, for example, can be teams which are helping each other the most. So through this, we are basically trying to sort of highlight that we all come from very different baselines. We all have different abilities to climb the tree at this moment. At the same time, as this examiner, we're not just focusing on who can climb this the fastest, but we're actually focusing on who's probably making the most effort, who's probably helping the other people out to sort of do that, or who's probably figuring out innovative methods to do that, and so on. So whatever values or efforts are important, you can essentially use those to reward. But we focus on inputs rather than the outcomes. And that I feel has a very strong advantage of setting the right kind of incentive for the learners, because now instead of chasing the highest marks in the examination, they would sort of work on things that actually sort of matter for the system. And then the fourth and the again a very important part of this entire system is we do not do objective assessment. So we will never, and again this is something which is heavily talked about in especially at the policy level, that we should stop giving marks to the people, and now we have started giving grades. But the idea that we at least follow is we do not do objective numbering. So we never tell you that you're A, B, C, or 190 or 80 or 70 or whatever. The focus is to give qualitative subjective feedback. And a lot of our assessments that we do, we don't have any examinations, but the student essentially go through continuous evaluation, which is very similar to how they would be interviewed in the industry. And the feedback that is given is essentially a qualitative feedback. And the students are encouraged to give feedback to each other, because when someone gives feedback to the other person, they also instinctively or intuitively get some feedback for themselves. So for example, one of the activity that happens in our English classes is an activity where the students essentially take multiple roles. For example, one student might be tracking time, one student might be tracking what are kind of pauses or breaks you're taking, and other kind of roles that they play. So when some students participate, the other people who are designated for these roles, they try to count those things and give that feedback to the speaker. So in some ways, the people who are essentially working in those roles are giving feedback, and intuitively they are also able to subconsciously understand how do they do on those feedback skills, right? Uh, so essentially, a lot of our work is essentially how do we design those subjective feedback systems where the students are giving feedback to each other. And one of the ways that we use is the good, bad, and the ugly system, where the students are encouraged to sort of share in three different headers. We just use this title because it's catchy, but the idea is that by every feedback should have a part where we share what is the good part that is happening, which essentially should ground the candidate in terms of making sure that they do not feel that they're not doing well, etc., and so on. Bad are things probably they can improve immediately, and ugly are things that they need to reflect upon. So loosely, this is a structure that we follow internally, but based on certain requirements, we modify the structure to do different things. But largely over here, the idea here is to make sure that the students themselves are responsible for their learning. It's not a push from our side, but the student take their own time. So student may take 6 months to get a job, student may take 1.5 years to get a job. Our job is to support them until they are able to sort of get the job. In fact, one of the things that we have done, which I find very interesting, is that we've created a small tracker based on their progress, which basically shares how much time would they take to get a job. For example, the tracker may say, Abhishek, roughly with your current speed, you will take another 7 months to get a job. And then Abhishek can choose to work harder and get a job in 6 months, or Abhishek can sort of continue to work at the same pace and get a job within 7 months. And it goes back to the trust, right? I mean, when the students are coming from such faraway areas, they're coming there to learn, their incentives to make sure that they get job early is pretty high. So they make that effort and we support them in that. And that's one of the reasons why I feel that this is a very strongly self-directed learning setup. One of the things that people sort of typically immediately sort of say when we talk about these things, how do you scale up, right? I mean, essentially, if you're relying too much on culture, there are no teachers, there are no exams per se. What is your strategy scaling up? So one thing I strongly believe in is the fact that culture is something which essentially scales up a lot. In fact, it's one of the very powerful things to scale, even though we feel like cultures typically do not scale. But to be honest, culture is essentially a very important part of how we are going to scale this up. We already have 5 campuses for NavGurukul, which roughly cover about 800 students, and we're opening many more campuses. And the idea for all of these campuses is to make sure that the learning environment is an enabling environment for the student to not just work on their learning, but also to support each other. And a big part of our team energy goes into making sure that the culture-wise, campuses are able to take care of themselves. In fact, one of the campuses, which is in Dharamshala, there has hardly been any team members since last roughly 2 years. The entire campus is sustaining just on the students and one of the alumni who basically works as sort of a community manager. But apart from that, there is no person from the program team who has been there for the last 2 years. So a lot of this essentially can happen because for at least 2 to 3 years, the culture was properly seeded. The students have been sort of following a lot of those things, and now it's a part of that campus, and it's very hard to take that away from it. But apart from that, we do have many of the things to sort of support it. One of the very important part is an application that we call Miraki. It's an online application through which we teach programming, not just to the 800 students that we have at NavGurukul, but also many, like roughly around 4,000 students who we are teaching online. And we are continuously sort of working on getting more learners. So we have done partnerships with state governments to onboard more than, I think, 35,000 students in last 1 month. So we've just started onboarding them. Idea of Miraki is very simple. We are teaching programming to the underprivileged girls in the most rural and the tribal setting. And when we sort of do them, we have done many innovations in this application. One of the very interesting innovation is to get 100 rupees keyboard and connect it to their phone. And then they use this phone to practice programming on their phone. And similarly, they use this keyboard to learn typing on their phone. And this is very interesting because to learn typing right now, people need to have a laptop or a desktop. And typically it is very prohibitive, especially at families who cannot afford it. But with this 120 rupees setup, they can simply use their phone to learn skills like typing and programming on their phone. We teach along with programming and typing English as well. So it's also one idea that we are using a lot to scale up, not just inside, but also outside. The other part of how we are sort of scaling up our impact is through a program that we call Core India Fellowship. It's very similar to how TFI the Teach for India Fellowship is sort of envisioned. The idea here is that we are getting fellows from the top colleges in the country who understand programming really, really well, and we are placing them in tier 2 and tier 3 colleges and working with those colleges to improve their placement outcomes in those colleges. So if you look at it, our residential program are more of job guarantee programs where the students from all over the country are coming in. But at the same time, we have an online program to improve the sort of number of people we are working with. But since it is online, the efficacy is not as high as what our residential program is. Code India Fellowship can be seen as a more of a hybrid in between, where we, instead of students coming to us, we directly go to the existing colleges with our fellows, with our curriculum that they've already built, which is available in vernacular languages, with our placement network we already have. And we try to support and work on existing colleges rather than creating the new infrastructure over here. And the third part, this is not a scale-up plan, but this is something that we have started as a pilot this year, is a school of design, where just on the lines of what we do at software, we're essentially creating this similar kind of curriculum and pedagogy and culture to learn design. So we have started a pilot with 10 students, and the pilot is going to finish somewhere around February in the next year, or February, March. And that is the time when we're going to start scaling that program up. So a plan basically in the coming years is to keep adding at least one course every single year, and make sure that the same backbone that I'm talking about, which is neutral, right? I mean, it doesn't necessarily it's not software engineering specific. We can use the same backbone for other courses with a very simple underlying common backbone, which is to make sure that the students are going through an intense 1 year to 15 months sort of learning journey and getting aspirational jobs. So those are some ideas that I think are sort of critical to our organization right now. Just wanted to sort of stop for questions.
Thanks, Abhishek. I think there's so much coming in, and I'm sure there are lots of questions that people have. I'll start with one question. So, what is the background of students that you've taken? What's the specific background, and how do you choose them?
Yeah. So we, so as I mentioned, our focus is in the most marginalized student community. So we work with basically students from all over the country. That's one. Second, we are agnostic to their qualifications. We have started recently adding a criteria of they have to be 10 pass, but earlier we also used to get students who are 8 pass or 9 pass as well. Most of these students are from basically, I mean, we are mostly focusing on girls only. So out of these 800 students, roughly 700 are women, are young women basically. In terms of their English and other skills, I mean, we look for basic English and very basic mathematics skills for them before they join our course. And largely that we do because we have to guarantee them the jobs. But apart from that, we do not have any sort of restricting criteria. In fact, students come to us after finishing their 10th class, 11th class, 12th class. They might be pursuing graduation. Very few people are there who have also completed the graduation. Most of them come from non-science departments. They're mostly from arts or commerce or other departments, basically. And in terms of getting the students, we basically partner with the organizations, including the NGOs and the state governments largely. And these governments or the organization help us identify the students who can be potential fit for our courses. Then these students are basically given online tests on basis of which we select them and get them into our courses.
Okay.
I just have a question. How different are you from Zoho from Chennai?
Good question. So when we started NavGurukul, we actually went to Zoho to understand their model because Zoho has been doing this since 2005.
Yeah.
So I think
they take all kinds of students.
Yeah, they do. They do. So our students tend to be far more marginalized than what Zoho deals with. Like for example, with Zoho, some of the students will come from marginalized communities. Ours mostly will be marginalized. For example, if you just look at the gender ratio, getting a girl from, let's say, a place like Bihar or Assam to Bangalore to learn a course like software programming is not trivial. And for us to basically have close to 90% gender ratio has been one of the biggest challenges that we have faced so far. But that's something, for example, is not something that Zoho necessarily works on, right? At the same time, the amount of resources that are available per student is significantly different. The expenses that they do per student is very high. largely because they have a very strong business use case to be able to meet that cost and absorb them into their company. For us, we try to do all of this in roughly 1 lakh rupees cost, which includes all the costs that I'm mentioning: food, accommodation, laptops, internet, staff cost, program cost, all of those things basically included. So the cost-wise, our program is roughly, I would say, I don't know exactly at what cost does Zoho operate, but I guess it might be somewhere around, let's say, 20 to 30% of that. And then pedagogy-wise,
Zoho is basically completely in-house.
Yeah, and also pedagogy-wise, we are completely different. Right? I mean, they have highly qualified professors who are basically working with the students, and then they have an active, very strong and active, their in-house team who support the students as mentors. So there's a very strong difference in pedagogy as well.
I would like to know, how do you teach? Because the whole conversation till now was the senior student would be ending up teaching the next student. So how do you actually start teaching the senior student? Supposing you start a new campus in Bangalore.
We see.
How does it actually
start a new campus, we send our
Anuradha, this will be your last question. We will give others the chance to ask questions.
Sure, we'll do that.
So Abhishek, you can go ahead and ask.
So what we do is basically we seed. So let's say we are starting a new campus, we will send some of our old students who go and feed the culture. So as I mentioned, a lot of this is essentially seeding the right kind of learning practices. At the same time, all of our curriculum is available on Meraki as the platform. So that serves as the anchor for the student to basically learn from. But they do need support and holding of different people. And what also starts happening naturally in any group is that some people progress faster and some people progress slower. So in that case, people who are progressing faster, they end up being mentors to the people who are essentially struggling with their concepts. So naturally, it starts happening really quickly. But the seeding happens from outside. I mean, let's say when we opened our campus in Tripura, we sent our existing people from existing campuses to the new campus.
Thank you. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Guys, questions? If you don't, then Anuradha and I will ask questions.
That is a good one, Nimish.
So Abhishek, I have a follow-up question. On the economic model, you said the cost of education to a student is about 1 lakh, and I think you do not charge the students anything. Do you charge the students anything, or how?
It's a pay-forward model where the students basically pay forward once they get a job. And so far, we have received 27 lakhs in donations just from our own alumni.
From your alumni, okay.
Yeah.
Do you also get a placement charge?
We have not worked on that, but that's something that we want to figure out at some point. But so far, that's not our focus, largely because our focus is to make sure that everyone is getting a job.
Okay.
There is another school called University School of Education or something like that. World School of Education or World University. Just check on that. That model is also fascinating.
Sure. I have not heard about it, but definitely will check.
You know what I'm talking about?
No, I don't. I'll check for that.
I'll try and send that information to Nimish, maybe forward it to you.
Sure.
It's a very fascinating model because it's open-ended free education across the world. They have a limited number of courses for which you actually have to pay.
Oh wow, okay.
I must have that information somewhere. I'll locate it and send it across.
So Abhishek, what are the challenges that you face? I mean, what you have mentioned is, it all seems to work very well. So what's the challenge?
I don't even know where to start. I mean, so it's been a very crazy journey that way. It started with one residential aspect, right? I mean, if you want to do a residential campus for the girls and you want them to come throughout the India, it's a very hard problem to solve, especially when you're starting because you don't have a big brand and all of that to follow, right? So a lot of our challenges are essentially just cracking the residential model. Admissions has been one of the biggest problems. How do we identify the girls who also clear our entrance tests, which we have in maths and English? Largely because our state of education is so poor that even people who have finished their 12 classes, their understanding of maths and English will be so poor that you would struggle to teach them something like programming, right? And especially when they have to enter into professional careers and you're guaranteeing them a job. So it's to basically identify the student was a hard challenge. In fact, I'll give you one very simple example here. When we were working with Telangana government, we did a test in an orphanage, and I think out of 26 people, 14 were selected. So roughly 60% students were selected through our test. But when we went to Maharashtra and we did a test with the tribal welfare department for all the tribal students that we could mobilize, out of 4,200 girls, only 102 qualified, which was basically less than 3%. So essentially, when you want to fill up, let's say, 800 seats, and by the way, just to give some context here, until about 1.5 years ago, which is roughly just COVID starting time, March 2020, we had only 90 students and 3 team members. Right now, in COVID itself, we have scaled up our residential capacity from 80 to roughly 800, and a team of about 35. So a lot of our challenges also came in. How do we build this team, and all of this while COVID is happening, do admissions, get girls during COVID time to our campuses. So just imagine, girls coming from, let's say, Assam to Bangalore campus. And a lot of people, they come by sleeper trains, right? So it takes a lot of time for them to travel and so on. So a lot of those challenges definitely came. Initial few challenges were essentially heavily centered on the pedagogy. So all the things that I mentioned that we follow or we are working on as pedagogy were things that we didn't know. We had to basically come up with them as we face more and more problems. So for instance, council came when we realized that we will need to figure out a way which is cost optimal, but also help the local environment to sort of manage the campus. Even the pedagogy of mentorship came because we realized that we do not want to teach directly because that way will not be scalable. And even if we are able to get, let's say, 1 or 2 people to come and teach to our students, we will not be able to scale it up to all the campuses. So a lot of these things essentially were direct results of the challenge that we have. But if I talk about the challenges that we face today as an organization, I think largely the focus is, one, how do we keep scaling this up? Our idea is to reach 2,500 girls by March 2023. And we're totally on path of it. We're doing a lot of government partnerships to sort of do that. But apart from that, another big challenge is how do we scale this to other courses? So for example, design is one course that we are right now working on. But as I mentioned, we want to add one more course every year. So that's more on the challenges of how do we add more courses. So if I give you a very simple example, look at counseling as a course. In India, counseling is a very expensive service. Most of the good counselors you will be able to afford only from a price bracket of 1,000 rupees to 3,000 rupees session. But at the same time, you have people who probably do not even earn that much in an entire day, or maybe in a week, right? So that's where we see a big divide between requirement of highly skilled professionals, at the same time, people looking out for aspirational jobs. So what stops us from essentially, let's say, doing a course on counseling in, let's say, in parallel with what degree that is offered by IGNU, where let's say IGNU degree, make sure that the students are certified, we take care of their learning and experience, and make sure that they're getting placed afterwards, which also solves not just the problem for their employment, but also solve the problem for the cheaper access to counseling services. So a lot of these ideas and thought processes are there with the team, and we have initiated a lot of these threads. But yeah, it will take time for us to standardize a lot of these offerings, because it is not as simple as, let's say hiring a staff and saying, can you please start teaching them? A lot of this has to happen at a very systemic level. How do we build the right curriculum? How do we do it in a way such that teachers are required as little as possible, and so on. And again, we are not very hard bent about the fact that teachers are not going to be there. It's just that with software, we felt it was far more feasible. For example, with counseling or even with design, we do want to have some component of teaching who can give them a lot of subjective feedback. Software, fortunately, tends to be a little more objective. So a big part of what teachers do can essentially be done through machines. But this is not as prevalent in design, which would require a lot of subjective kind of feedback, which is needed from experts.
Gokul, you have a question?
Look at that school of design of yours. Yeah. Since most of us sitting here and listening to you are from design, I think all of us will be very, very curious to know how you're doing it and what you're doing.
Yeah, something very simple. We just started with a batch of about 10 girls in Pune. We're saying, Ab tum padho. These are the courses. We're using some of the Coursera courses, and we're providing them mentorship. And the target is very simple. In 1 year, they should get a 20,000 rupees job. And this 20,000 is very transformation, right? I mean, a girl, let's say, coming from a rural area or a tribal area, when they get a 20K girl, it's a transformational thing for them. They become the power centers or the financial centers or the socio-economic centers of the family. So one very simple example is that none of our alumni, female alumni, have gotten married so far. And again, we are not anti-marriage institution. It's just that it represents that they have bigger choice, access in their lives right now. So the idea for us is very simple. How do we make sure that in this environment that we are creating, the students are able to learn, support each other, and are able to get jobs. And in this system, we are now essentially connecting them with outside mentors until the course is properly seeded. Because as I mentioned, seeding is a very important part of it. And obviously right now we don't have that because they're the first time learners for us. So a lot of that seeding is happening from outside volunteers or mentors. And slowly we'll try to make sure that that capacity exists with these students.
Gokul, you have a question?
Yeah. Abhishek, first of all, where did you get all this wisdom to really look at educating the right way? It is 180-degree away from all the competition and all the only one winner can be there, and one to many kind of a teaching. This is mind-boggling. And all this is not a commercial venture, it is more of a social venture. Like, what is it that at such a young age prompted you to do something which is so apt and seem to be made to work also, as well as absolutely not something which we have heard of anywhere? What is it that is the key for having been able to do something like this?
I think in terms of work, largely a lot of ideas that, as I mentioned, they're essentially borrowed. I mean, they're not necessarily our ideas. We went to different institutions. For example, Zoho, we went, and then there are so many alternative institutions that we went to understand how do they do or work on their own learning systems. So we try to incorporate their systems with as much humility as possible, and largely focus on our constraints properly. So I think one thing that really helped us was to set constraints very clearly from the day one. For instance, I still remember the post that I wrote in the first week of starting NavGurukul, which was pretty much what I talked about in this conversation, where the idea was to how do we build a job guarantee course with as few resources as possible and with a very strong emphasis on learning and facilitating journey rather than pushing content on someone or basically mistrusting someone and saying मैं तेरे को पढ़ाऊंगा और मैं तेरे को test करूंगा वाली approach, right? And a lot of this probably comes from my own journey where I feel I was made to study things in a way where I started hating things which I absolutely loved. I mean, I grew up as a person who hated English, who hated history, who hated most of these things. I loved math and Sanskrit. I found them very objective and all of that. But somehow when I grew up, I'm like, oh shit, what did I miss? Like, there's so beautiful world of English and history. I think a lot of it I missed because I was mostly, it was a marks thing for us or it was something that we had to do because we were supposed to do it. And when I started getting that freedom in my own learning spaces, I could see that change. So a lot of these, I think, ideas are things that I have personally felt and also things that people around us already have as sort of so-called wisdom, but we just try to make sure that at an institutional level, we are very open to using it to scale. I think what one of the differences that we have seen with some of these alternative organizations is that they do not think of scaling it up. They feel it's such a people thing that as a founder, they are going to be there all the time and they're going to make sure that it is scaling up. I mean, the quality is going to be really, really high. And that also came to us as a conflict, right? I mean, when essentially we started for the NavGurukul, I mean, for the first 2 years or 3 years, I stayed in the campuses. So when I had to stop doing that, there was a clear conflict in front of us that I wanted to scale, but the quality would obviously change when you're going to do that. So again, but I think for me, it was to trust. It was to trust that maybe quality will go down a bit, but at the same time, it is important to trust the system and it take its own course. But I think somewhere, fortunately, all of these principles are already there in the Indian education system. We just have to embrace them again in whatsoever way works for our own context.
And curious to know what kind of a design domain are you kind of upskilling these children with? Are they more in the software specific, UI specific kind of
graphic design?
Graphic design. So it's more in alignment with the software industry needs.
Yeah. So far, yes.
Thanks.
So
amazing.
I think for us, it was easier to do it that way because we already get a lot of requests for graphic designers. So we just thought we'll create that pipeline and anyhow we'll have a very strong hiring pipeline for that. But I think one of the organizations that we are partnering with, it's an organization based out of Udaipur. So we are partnering with them to do a similar course for creating facilitators. So in that case, we are going to use the similar pedagogy. We are using some of our own machinery, but they are going to focus on doing this for creating facilitators who can essentially do sessions on, let's say, body movement sessions or other kind of facilitation that happens. So I think, but as a pedagogy or as a philosophy or as any which way you think about it, it doesn't really matter you use it for what. You can use it for anything and just do it. Largely, the focus here is how do you build an aspirational career from someone, for someone who basically currently may feel that it is out beyond reach for them.
Okay. Amazing. Admire.
Chaudhary, I think you have a question.
Yeah. In fact, coming to the question of culture, the culture is a good interpretation.
Chaudhary, you are not clear. Do you want to type it or?
Am I audible now?
Yeah, this is better.
In an educational institution, I feel culture is the very core one. Was this culture evolved or it was by design?
It evolved. It evolved significantly. So as I mentioned, there were many things that we didn't expect, and they came as problems in our campuses, and they really, really helped us to understand what is that we need from our culture or expect from our culture. And also, it is continuously evolving as well, right? I mean, as we are scaling up, some parts of our culture we have, they're changing the way they basically manifest on ground. So for instance, let's say the amount of ownership that the student or the council used to have was so much higher than when we started, largely because we were also doing smaller batches or 20 or 30 people. So in 30 people, operations are actually easier, and probably the council, the student council can themselves understand and do work on them. But as we're doing, let's say, bigger campuses of 200 or 300 students, it's not easy for the student council to take all the decisions. And we do need expertise opinion, and that's where the program managers are coming in, where we sort of try to make sure that they are working in tandem with the council. But it's not exactly as same as when it used to happen with the smaller campus, right? So I think culture that way is definitely evolving a lot. But I think that the core theme for us is essentially how do we create an enabling culture which makes sure that the students are not just careful about their own learning journeys, where we trust them, but also they are trying to facilitate and support each of the learning journeys. So if that is true as a principle, where we trust students and they facilitate each other and take care of their own journeys, largely I feel the system will grow in the right direction.
So I think we have time for maybe another one or two questions.
Hi, this is Prakash here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely. I can hear you very well.
So I don't have a question, but I'm very impressed with your presentation, Abhishek. I think more power to people like you. I mean, very interesting work, and it really requires a lot of, teamwork and energy, time, and all that. And above all that, it requires real courage to take that path. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
So Abhishek, so you said by 2023 you want to touch about 2,500. What is do you have a vision for the next 5 years, 10 years? Because it looks like, the demand is infinite.
Yeah. So, okay. So there are multiple parts of NavGurukul. So one is the residential campuses. So over there, we can scale up to 2,500 very easily, even in next 1.5 years or so, largely because we're doing government partnerships. For example, the one we're doing with Delhi government is where the government is taking care of the infrastructure and operations, and we are focusing on the training and the placement. And that's the model we want to work going further, because it essentially helps us focus on what we do best, which is the learning culture, training and the placements part of it, rather than focusing on the operational sides of it. And similarly, our Tripura campus is on the same model. So through this, we are basically very sure that we will be able to open one campus every 2 months starting from next year. So we just opened our Tripura campus a week ago. Delhi campus is opening in January. in March we are opening either Gujarat or Odisha campus. So those are almost towards the final stages. Then we are opening a campus in Amravati somewhere around July or August. So essentially, residential campus that way is a place where we are mostly focused on standardizing and improving the scale. And this is heavily supported by the Code India Fellowship, where I mentioned we are getting fellows from the top colleges, including colleges like IIT Delhi or other IITs, blah blah blah. And we're basically getting these fellows to tier 2 colleges and also our own campuses. Idea being same, the fellows are going to work on the placement. So that way we are also able to support our existing campuses, not just with our own alumni and students, but also through some external people who can bring in more perspective. So to give some more context here, almost 60 to 70% of our team is our own alumni. But we also want to diversify this a bit, so that for every campus we have exposure from both inside and what existed, but also from outside to what does not exist right now. So that's the second part of it. The third part of it, as I mentioned, is Meraki, where we are essentially doing all this online. Meraki is interesting. It is directly in alignment with national education policy. It has the potential to scale up really rapidly. The problem with Meraki or any online platform is, especially with the underprivileged people, how do you really make an impact? तो मेरे को बस एक प्रॉब्लम ही होती है, आप लड़की को पाइथागोरस से सिखा दो, पाइथन सिखा दो. Ultimately, if she gets married at 18, and with the kind of domestic abuse rates that are in India, the Pythagoras is not going to help him. Python is not going to help her. Sorry. So, I mean, for us, one of the things that we focus on is how do we not focus on life learning outcomes, but rather focus on life outcomes. And that is a very hard thing to do online. Because online, let's say, even if I achieve some learning outcomes, how does it translate into life outcomes is what we are really interested in. And that's our current direction of work, at least in online system. And we consciously sort of try to diminish our work on life learning outcomes and just focus on the life outcomes instead. So whenever something happens, we just ask the students, did something change for you in your life? If it doesn't, we're still not there, basically. So those are the three major directions that are established, that are anyhow growing inside NavGurukul. The fourth part is basically adding more courses that I mentioned. So for all these parts, we have essentially identified a new director person who's going to take over all of these things from me. And I'm going to completely shift to a new vertical that we are calling labs. For me to lay out the vision of labs is going to be really hard because it's something that we are still experimenting on. But the idea for labs is very simple. Because we don't have time, I'll not go into a lot of details for that. But very briefly, we want to do what Amul did for milk, we want to do it in technology. We feel technology is very centralizing and monopolizing nature, as it's a very strong centralizing and monopolizing force. And unfortunately, coupled with gig economy, it can literally change our economy in such a significant way, which may not necessarily work for the people. So the hypothesis that we're testing out in the labs is how do we marry technology with the cooperative model and create cooperative alternatives of ventures like Uber, White Hat, or some of these popular gig economy models. So that's our newer initiative, which I am going to completely focus my energy starting January 2022. But again, the vision is chaotic because these four things we are handing over. Now I am handing over, and I'm going to focus my energies over here. But we're very excited because over here we are also getting a lot of support from people, especially from people who are working in tech companies, because they realize the kind of damage that some of these initiatives are doing to the economy in general. But it's a long shot for us, for sure. I mean, it's a long shot because this is not education per se, as much as it is about building. Another very important reason why some people ask us, like, why are we doing this? So obviously a lot of this is by what we see, but also we do have access to a lot of technology from our own alumni. So we are going to be leveraging it to build some of these solutions anyhow. So for example, for Meraki, building us Meraki was actually very cheap, which could have costed much more for someone else.
Yeah, I think.
But yeah, probably I'll be talking about this 2 years later.
Yeah, so in another 6 months we'll call you for how what is cooperative technology and how is it different from open source. So we'll call you for that.
Yeah, I mean the software will be open source, but the organization will have an operational cooperative model just like Amul has, right? For example, Amul has a very strong cooperative organizational structure and operational flow. For example, how the money is dispersed to the people and so on, how the people involved in the administration get money and so on. So we are not just going to restrict ourselves to creating those open source softwares, but we are going to actually create an operational cooperative layer, just like Amul did, or Lizard did, right? So that's the major difference.
So we got a question. Is Meraki same as Cisco Meraki?
Oh no, I'm really sorry. We actually took the name and Cisco is already popular, but the second result afterwards will be Meraki.
Okay, it's not.
It'll be
Okay.
Meraki Python or Meraki NavGurukul, either way. You will search for it.
Okay.
Hi, I had a question if you have time.
Okay.
I have time.
Last question.
Abhishek, for a group like this, right? How do we get in touch, and what kind of ways can do you think we can involve? Is there any?
Yeah. So I'll just write my email ID here. As an organization, we work extensively with people who are not from the organization. In fact, interestingly, we have done many organizational changes to sort of support that. For instance, we have to most of our team members, we have an external coach system where we club with them. Where we club them with an external person who works as a coach or an advisor to that particular person. So that way, we are essentially able to get talent which may not be something that we can hire right away, but directly assisting our existing talent and improving the outcomes. So in fact, for instance, at Meraki, our Android lead is a volunteer, our backend lead is a volunteer, our designer is also a volunteer. So a lot of our work essentially is driven by volunteers, and I think roughly we're working about around 60 to 70 people who are assisting in all of these things. So that way we are very heavily sort of supportive, and I mean not supportive, I would say we are heavily supported by the volunteers, and we basically make sure that I mean all the decisions that we take and all those things are essentially our processes where we involve people directly.
Thank you, Abhishek. I think you are going to get a lot of emails. I'll also circulate your email in the groups that we are part of.
Sure.
So thank you again for being part of this and giving us this talk, and thank you everyone for joining the talk today. Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye.